Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we have a compelling game from the FTX Crypto Cup. Alireza Firouzja against Quang Liem. Now this is a game that has everything. It has sacrifices. It has deep, meaty play in every single phase of the game. I think you're going to enjoy it. Alireza Firouzja has the white pieces. Quang Liem has the black pieces. This was played at a rapid time control. Alireza begins with e4. He plays everything. Again, he played e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. The Ruy Lopez or Spanish opening. a6, bishop to a4, knight to f6, putting pressure on e4, castles, b5, bishop to b3, and bishop to c5. The Molar or Archangel defense for black. This is also in Alireza's repertoire, even though in this game he's playing against it with the white pieces. c3 is played. The basic idea is to play d4, hit the bishop with tempo and get a full pawn center on e4 and d4. d6, d4, the move is played, bishop to b6. Now, the most common continuation, or the most modern continuation, is bishop to e3. Here, Alireza plays rook to e1. Looks very natural. It's a little more rare. The only issue is that it does leave f2 a little sensitive, and with the bishop on b6 aiming in this direction, that's just a little possible concern, but not an issue yet. Castles and bishop to g5, a very annoying pin, and Quang Liem decides to immediately put the question to the bishop, h6, and bishop to h4. So we have an equal position, but a very dynamic position. White wants to maintain this very nice center, and black wants to find a way to attack it as intensely as they can. First of all, Quang Liem takes on d4. Now bishop to d5, hits the knight at c6, pins it to the rook, and here bishop to d7 was played. Bishop to b7 also can be played here, but bishop to d7 is played, and that's a new move. Pawn takes d4, and here g5. A risky move, a very sharp move, advancing the pawns in front of his king while the center is sort of open at the moment. It's risky, but again, this is just how people are playing these positions these days. They've learned a lot from these advanced computers, and computers do this. So now players are doing this too. Bishop takes knight was played in the past. Knight takes g5 was played, but after a few complex lines, what ends up happening is it looks like white has a vicious attack, but after a move like knight to f5, hitting this bishop and defending the h6 pawn, actually black is doing quite well in this position. So Alireza doesn't do that. He grabs the knight on c6. Now he's giving up the two bishops, giving his opponent the advantage of the two bishops, but what he's doing is he's trying to protect this center. That knight was attacking the d4 pawn, so he wants to eliminate it to keep the center strong. Bishop takes c6, and this is another idea, queen to c1. Now, he's drawn the bishop to the c6 square, and that means the queen is attacking the bishop, but it's also attacking this g5 pawn. So now, if Firouzja plays the sacrifice on g5, it's going to cause a lot more devastation. And what Quang Liem decides to do is to take the pawn on e4 with his bishop. And now, knight to g5 is much more powerful than it was in the previous variation because the queen is now a part of the discussion. Pawn takes knight and queen takes g5 check. Not only does it check the king, but it also attacks the knight on f6 twice. Firouzja is regaining his material. The bishop goes back to g6 and now captures twice on f6. So we can take a look at this position. What are the imbalances? Essentially, black has the advantage of the two bishops and also a healthier pawn structure on the queen side with this sort of 3-2 majority. But Firouzja's big trump is this pawn on h2. It's a passed pawn. It's on the side of the board. It's part of a healthy structure. So that's a real feather in Alireza's cap as the game progresses. Rook f to e8. Knight to c3 with the threat of jumping into d5 and harassing the bishop at b6. So c6 prevents that from happening. Now d5, the pawn is advanced, and c5. It would be a mistake to hit the knight with b4 because then knight to a4 hits the bishop at b6. When that moves, pawn takes. And that's a good situation for white. So instead, Quang Liem plays c5. And now this is a very healthy queenside pawn structure. Very healthy 3-2 majority, and he's got the two bishops. He's getting play here. The knight goes to e2. Another idea was rook a to c1 to help slow down the advance of the c pawn. But instead, knight to e2 with the idea of going to f4 and then hitting that bishop on g6, getting rid of the two bishops. So rook to e4 was played to keep white's knight from going to the f4 square. f3 hits the rook. c4 check. discovery against the king. The king goes to f1, and now rook to e3, and knight to f4. Continuing this idea of capturing on g6, the bishop moves out of the way, doesn't want to be captured. And now rook to e2. He doesn't take the rook, because if he takes the rook, the bishop is annoying to that knight, and black has very active pieces, so he doesn't want to play that. So what Firouzja does is play rook to e2. He just moves it up one square to keep the bishop from landing on e3. Doubling rooks, and now b4. Quang Liem has this majority, and he's pushing it. He wants to play c3, c2, and eventually c1, and queen that pawn. Rook takes, and here, again, if he trades rooks, then black is in very, very good shape, hitting the knight, supporting the advance of the pawn to the queening square. So instead, after trading one pair of rooks, the rook goes to c1 to slow down that passed pawn. Now, bishop to d7 was the strongest move. The idea is you can go to b5. If he plays rook takes pawn, then just bishop b5 would pin that rook. So moving it to b5 was the strongest idea, but instead he jumps into d3 with check. Knight takes bishop, pawn takes, and here black is threatening rook to e2. Rook on the 7th, attacking b2 and all along the 7th rank. So to stop that, Firouzja plays rook to e1, so that if the rook goes to e2, he would just take it. But now d2. The pawn goes to d2, and obviously he can't take the rook because he'd promote with a queen to a queen. But rook to d1 is played, and Quang Liem has to say, how am I going to hold on to this pawn on d2? He comes up with this idea. b3, opening up the diagonal for the bishop at a5 to defend d2. Pawn takes, and now bishop to a5. And Quang Liem is threatening rook to e1, which is essentially a decisive situation. He can't play rook to e1 because he would either lose the rook or he'd promote to a queen with mate. So how does Firouzja stop this threat of rook to e1 check? Well, he plays this move, bishop to c3, interfering with this bishop's line of defense of the d2 pawn. Bishop takes bishop, pawn takes, rook c3, and rook takes d2, rook takes b3. So Firouzja is still up a pawn. He has a healthier pawn structure versus these three weaknesses of black's, and he's still got the passed h-pawn. So let's see how Firouzja handles this endgame. Rook to a2, hitting the a6 pawn. Rook to b6, defending it. He could have counterattacked the d5 pawn, but you still get a similar situation, 2 versus 3 in this case. So he defends the a6 pawn. King f2, king g7, g4, advancing the pawn majority on the king side. King to f6. The king would like to get into e5 or g5, so f4 was played. You shall not pass. You're not getting into this part of the board. Rook to b5 was played to counterattack b5. Rook takes a6, rook takes d5, but now h4. White has an h-pawn. He wants to ram it up the board with h5, h6, and race and get there before black does. Rook to d1, h5, king to e6, rook to a2, king to f6, cutting off the king so it can't advance to the next rank. Rook to h1, king g2, rook h4, king g3, rook h1, and now rook to a2. Maybe it could form a bridge to keep this rook from stopping the h-pawn. d5 is played, but now rook to a6, forcing the king back to its own second rank. King to e7, h6, also defending this pawn. d4 and king to f3. And Alireza's idea here is to play the king to e4, f5, and to g5 to help escort this h6 pawn down the board. Rook to h3 check. King to e4. As it turns out, king to e2 was a bit better move, keeping this king available to stop the d pawn. After king f8, king e7, g5, white is winning in that position. But king to e4 was played. It's still okay for white, but he has to play a little more accurately after this move. d3. And the king, because he played to e4, is cut off from this line. And that can be difficult to deal with. g5, d2, one square away from queening. Rook to a1, stopping that pawn from queening. King to e6 was played. Turns out rook to h2 apparently was the one move to draw the position. After rook to d1, f6, king f5, taking, king to f7, g6, king to f8, this position is a draw because each side can keep the other side from advancing. But instead, black plays king to e6, And now rook to d1 is a winner, because after rook h2 check, f5 check, king to e7, king to e3, and now these pawns are in much better position to advance. f6, g6. Now that gives up a pawn, or trades a pawn as it turns out. Rook takes pawn, rook takes d2. So now Quang Liem with black is going to try to create a fortress with these pieces, and white's got to find a way to break through. So let's see if Firouzja can do that. Rook to h5 hits the pawn, king f4 defends, rook h4, king f3, back, and rook to e2 check, king f8. Now Alireza is trying to find a way to break through here. King g4, rook g5, rook to h1 was an alternative, but after rook e6 hitting the f6 pawn, he would be in trouble. So king g4, rook to g5 check, king f4, rook g1, rook to e6, aiming at the f6 pawn, rook f1 check, king g4, back and forth a bit. Now he decides to bring his king to the second half of the board. Rook d1 check, king d5, rook d1, king c6, king g7, check, king g8, and rook f7, attacking the pawn at f6, rook to a1, and be very, very careful. If rook takes f6, white would lose to this. Rook to a6 check, and you pick up the rook and win the game. So Firouzja does not fall for that. Instead, he plays king to d7, rook to a7 check, king to e8. If he plays rook to a8, just king e7, and then he would win the pawn with his king that way. So rook to a5 counterattacks the pawn at f5. Now rook takes pawn. And this rook also defends the f4 pawn. Rook e5. And now with a two-pawn advantage, it's basically a matter of technique, as they say. He arranges his king. Rook to f5, and now rook to b8 check. And the only way to stop the check is to play rook to f8. Rook takes rook was played, king takes rook, and g7 check would be a blunder. After king g8, king g6 is a stalemate. But after the simple king to h7, there's nothing black can do to stop the pawn from advancing. Now, even after this great game from Alireza Firouzja, there are still some great chess you are missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the game you're going to want to look at is this one right here. You're going to see some really mind-blowing chess.